You know, over the past couple of weeks, I found myself really overwhelmed with the sheer volume of video games and opportunities to play games currently on the market. Modern gaming has put us in a position where there's no shortage of content at any given point. We have access to way more content than a human being can ever physically play all the way through at our fingertips at all times. We have more content than we know what to do with, and what we're lacking on the other side of that coin is something that's a bit more concise, smaller scale, a tiny story about something really special, and just a quick couple of really good hours of fun and gameplay, and something that isn't just trying to drag out your time. And I think, of all of these choices in modern gaming that I've had over the past couple of weeks, one night I actually found myself really wanting to play a classic Halo 3 ODST. Now, it's not just AAA titles that have this problem of bloat in their games and this time maximization. Other indie titles can do this too, and also Bungie and Halo, by extension, is not exactly an indie title. I mean, this is an absolute titan and juggernaut in the gaming industry in and of itself. But by comparison now, Halo 3 ODST is like over 10 years old, and it's a more quaint game even for the Halo series. It was initially just a small, side story DLC for Halo 3 that ended up taking on a life of its own. But I would argue it's still one of the most memorable experiences that you can have, not only in the Halo franchise, but it's surprisingly refreshing for where we're at in the overall atmosphere and landscape of modern video gaming.
Seriously?
In modern video gaming, it can start to feel like just simply throwing money at an issue from the publisher and developer side will make a game better, which is clearly not always true, and I think that's evident with rises of titles, like Helldivers and on these other AA studios really taking the market. AAA gaming and just simply throwing money at an experience is not necessarily the key to making something unforgettable, and Halo 3 ODST I think is one of the prime examples of this fact. It's a game that is on a budget scale much smaller than any of the mainline Halo titles, but that meant that the entire team and staff that made ODST had to get really creative about what they wanted to do with this vision. The whole idea of playing as Master Chief and, being the absolute demon of the Covenant in every single mainline Halo gave you this certain expectation for what a Halo game from Bungie is supposed to feel like. ODST was going to flip that entire formula on its head, and instead of playing as Master Chief, you would play as these orbital drop shock troopers that are not quite Spartan level, and this would change how Halo fundamentally plays entirely. From a story and narrative perspective, instead of focusing on this giant space odyssey of all of these, galaxy-changing events going on at once in this broad stroke approach, it's actually just a much more intimate story about a couple of troopers who are trying to make their way through this city, essentially, and the interpersonal relationship between all of these characters, their dynamic, and the relationships with each other is what moves the plot along forward and ultimately allows them to be very memorable characters in their own right. I think they're just as memorable in some sense as a character like Master Chief or Cortana or whatever, just for much different reasons. Now, the reason I brought up modern gaming at the beginning of this video is because that night I decided to play ODST, I had the option to play, any number of modern video games at my fingertips. There was literally hundreds of options I could have spent my time playing. Could have dumped hours into, mindlessly grinding Destiny. I could have played Elite, Smash, God help me. I could have, played some Call of Duty. I could have done whatever with my time, but I decided to spend my 3.5 hours playing the ODST campaign. You know what? It was one of the more memorable gaming nights I've had in a long time, and because I haven't played ODST in so long, it hit in a way that I really wasn't expecting and completely inspired me to make a video on it. If I had to describe in one word what playing ODST was like recently, I would say refreshing. It was a really nice change of pace just to play something that was a small and simple, scaled back story for once. I'm not saying that there isn't utility in having these grand experiences, and I'm also not saying that Halo isn't that, because clearly that's what Halo 1, 2, and 3 fundamentally are. But ODST is obviously this small side story that's going on a bit behind the scenes. It's a part of Halo I still think is underdeveloped and underappreciated, but is still fundamental in the world building of that universe and helping you appreciate the scale of what's going on. When you're Master Chief, you just literally blow up the Covenant with basically no trouble. But ODSTs, you can see that they have a much harder time time dealing with these kinds of things, and that makes Master Chief feel more powerful and you feel more vulnerable when you play this game. Now, this video is not going to be a full story breakdown of what happens in ODST, because either you've played the game yourself or there's plenty of other great YouTubers out there that have made fantastic videos that go into much greater depth than I would about the story. However, I am going to touch on the story in important key moments and where I think it's necessary to highlight what makes ODST so special, because that's what I wanted to get to at the heart of it all. With all of these choices for modern games that I had, why did I choose to play ODST that night, and why did a smaller game with a much smaller development team and budget make a really short game that's only a few hours long? Why did that stick with me much more than, you know, the countless hours I would have sunk into any other modern AAA game at the moment? Originally, I was thinking about titling this video something like when they used to make video games real good or something like that, but I changed my mind because it's not that modern games can't or, you know, aren't good in their own ways, but it's the difference between making a game that's more content oriented versus making a small little 2 to 3 hour almost art piece. I'm not saying there aren't indie companies that aren't making games like this anymore, but, you know, for a title like Halo to do something this risky and low budget at the time, and just something so different for the genre of Halo, I mean, this is quite a different take on what the formula was up to this point. This sci-fi action Odyssey thing is now just being stripped down to this really small, like, film noir detective game that, you know, still has the Halo branding and all of the elements you've come to know and love, but it doesn't even have Master Chief at all. And I think that was a great deliberate choice that was made because it didn't derail the weight of what was happening in ODST. I really think if another company like, I don't know, 343, for example, were to have made ODST instead, you know, a completely different set of creative directors, I don't think they would have been able to resist having some kind of end cutscene where Master Chief shows up right at the end. You know, I don't think they would have been able to resist. I understand Sergeant Johnson shows up at the end in that epilogue, but, you know, that's not the same as Chief coming in. That's totally different. In the era of Marvel post-credit scenes, I can just see if ODST was made in modern day, we would have had that shot right at the end of, you know, Master Chief walking right at the end. And the problem with that for me is that it would have really detracted from everything that ODST was about and then just become about Master Chief again. He's got his own games for that, but I really feel like focusing in on this smaller story was like the best thing they could have done. Resisting all the urges to throw in Halo stuff at the end and make Master Chief the hero and stuff really allowed this squad to be the highlight and the focus, allowed them to breathe and blossom, and I truly think the ODST squad is some of the most memorable characters in Halo's universe, period.
Hey, partner, real quick, we got some orders from up top. Master Chief actually asked you to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Those orders came from the Chief himself, so get to it.
So to give a quick recap of what Bungie wanted to do with ODST, this is essentially a small story that's still taking place in Halo's universe and is between the end of Halo 2 and the beginning of Halo 3, where Master Chief boards the Covenant cruiser. And instead of focusing on what Chief is doing, we take control of the ODSTs that are in charge of helping defend New Mombasa. These troops are not superhuman Spartans, they're just simply normal people, and they're the best we've got for defending against the Covenant on Earth right now. And we're introduced to our team of Veronica Dare, Buck, Mickey, Romeo, Dutch, and so on. And for most of the game, we play as the rookie of this squad. However, in flashback missions, we will actually see what happened from the perspective of each ODST troop. Now, I have to go back to modern video games for a moment because this is another great example of what ODST does so well. In a lot of more modern video games, we have characters and exposition just yapping. They're, you know, unbelievably long strings of dialogue and just talking for no real reason. Much of the information is just expendable and it's not incredibly important. However, in ODST, because of the creative control they had and also probably the limited budget, they had to make every single line of dialogue count. It feels like every word in ODST is there for a reason. All of the dialogue between characters and their interactions are very concise, they're sharp, clever, and they could not be more dialed in if they want to. In the introduction of the game, we get some good characterization of every single person in the ODST squad. We learned that Buck and Veronica Dare had probably some kind of more romantic relationship in the past, but now feels strictly professional.
Come on, Veronica. What could be more important than that carrier?
My orders. And Buck, call me Captain.
Buck still feels some type of way about it because he's a bit defensive from Romeo. We learn that Dutch and Mickey have almost complete opposite personality traits, and that will come into play later down the road when it comes to certain situations. But the point of this is that there's a quick, like, brief 2 or 3 minute cutscene that gives us good characterization of everybody that we're going to be paying attention to throughout the game. What I've noticed is that ODST's writing is so good that every line of dialogue or any exposition in the game not only serves a function to move the plot along forward, but also, you know, is like color commentary and highlights some of the characters' personality perspectives and helps make them feel more unique. Every piece of dialogue serves 2 functions. It's building out the world, and it's also building out the characters. A good example of this is right when Buck lands out of his drop pod. He and Veronica are having a brief conversation because she's strayed off course and you're not really sure why, and the plot moving along is that you need to go save her, but the way they talk about it alludes to something happening between them previously in the past, you know, off camera, but it gets that mystery going and it starts to make you think about what is really happening.
First, you're the best soldier I know, and second, I don't remember that night. What you asked me in the morning?
ODST was the first Halo game that I'd argue really tried to focus in and highlight the interpersonal relationships between people and how this conflict between humanity and the Covenant is affecting the average everyday person. I mean, we focus on Master Chief a lot, and I would say Cortana and him are the closest we get to a real relationship of sorts, but it's not really the same as what you would get with ODST. They would expand on that in further, you know, iterations such as Halo Reach, but I think it pretty much lived and died there. So the general idea of ODST, after the introduction where we are dropping into New Mombasa and the Covenant cruiser, you know, goes into slip space, and then the EMP causes all of the drop pods to spread across the city and the entire ODST squad gets separated. The whole idea is to link back up with your squad and also figure out what happened to everybody, because you have these sort of objects around the map that cause flashback missions to what really happened in that situation. And every time you're in the open world or this city area, New Mombasa, you're playing as the rookie, trying to find out what's going on and piecing the mystery together yourself. And then in these flashback missions, you'll cut to occasionally somebody in the ODST squad. You might play as Dutch or Romeo or whoever, and you'll kind of see what's going on. Now, the interesting thing is these missions can technically be played in any order, but for the sake of progression of the story, they have a general order they would like you to play them in. But this open world for Halo was very different at the time. New Mombasa is more of a central hub area than it is an open world, because I think that word gets construed as something very different in modern gaming, and it's clearly not like that at all. But you have this bigger city section that was clearly Bungie's big innovation for this game, and you make your way around the city looking for these different objects that cause the flashback missions and the story to progress. But in the meantime, you can explore the city to find other things. And I don't know if it was a budget thing or whatever, but in hindsight, I feel like ODST's open world hub design is simultaneously its best and worst feature. So I want to talk about the positives first and spend some time praising ODST's gameplay and its atmosphere and world building and everything that they really took the time and effort and creativity to make something unforgettable. That's probably ODST's greatest asset, is its unforgettable atmosphere. With many modern games being technically much better looking, games now have these crazy 4K textures and ray tracing and this unbelievable lighting. Like, games look so good now, they're almost indistinguishable from reality, and it's actually unbelievable. And ODST obviously just doesn't look as technically nice by comparison, but I was finding myself far more immersed in this world for completely different reasons, and it proves to me that graphics really aren't everything when it comes to immersing a player in an experience. That can help, sure, and ironically, I think Destiny, Bungie's current project, one of its greatest assets is its world design, actually, and its graphics, but that doesn't necessarily always make for a great game, and I think ODST still manages to make you feel a certain way using comparatively much fewer resources. Everything from the visuals to the dialogue, the music, the atmosphere, the lighting, and so on, they all come together to make ODST an absolute one-of-a-kind experience. And before we get to actual gameplay and stuff like that, I want to quickly mention the soundtrack. Ironically, it's going to be playing on loop throughout this video because it's so good, and Marty O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore absolutely cooked, and they fried when it came to this soundtrack. All right, let me just say that real quick. But on a more serious note, besides the soundtrack just being fantastic in and of itself. I also think that, games nowadays, we tend to have looping background music just for almost everything. When you're walking around an area in a video game, there's always something going on in the background. Maybe the same theme song for that area is constantly looping. In ODST, because they're trying to really capture and strike this feeling of loneliness in the city, what happens is you'll get a track start at the beginning of a mission, and as you're making your way throughout this area, it only plays once. And I know that might not seem like a big deal initially, but I think it, number one, makes you cherish that song more, but it also means that they've carefully curated the level to kind of correspond to where the player is going to be and what's happening in the world at that given time, and you can create these really powerful moments by something as simple as having two grunts in a hallway during a certain section of music, or coming across the brutes strapping an engineer with explosives during the end of that song, or something like that. But the fact that they only play once definitely leaves you feeling with this sense of isolated loneliness, and it makes you appreciate the atmosphere in the world that much more. Now, another thing you can do in the open world and look out for as you're traversing are these different computers and these terminals that are, basically linked to the superintendent, and you'll get these audio logs and sort of telephone calls that lay out what is called Sadie's story. This is a completely unrelated narrative to what is happening with the current ODST squad and the entire main storyline. Now, technically it is still connected, just not directly. It is relevant near the end, and it's also excellent world building and helps illustrate what was happening as soon as the Covenant were invading. Sadie's story is basically about the daughter of the scientist who created the superintendent AI. You learn about that whole situation with Sadie and the cop that helps her out named Mike and everything like that. And so this stuff is excellent, and I also really want to point out, more so than what is happening in Sadie's story itself, I think the way it's done is really great. Now, technically, you can actually look at these in your visor, and they have pictures to illustrate what's happening in the story, but the way that I like to consume it is I just listen to them as I'm traversing the city, which is what I would assume most people who play the game for the first time are going to do. And again, what I said earlier about if a different studio had been making ODST, especially nowadays, they would have some kind of Master Chief cameo and stuff. I also think that the way they would do Sadie's story would probably be what is a more traditional video game CG cutscene now. It would be something like a very heavily visual thing, and that's fine. And I think ODST didn't do stuff like that because, number one, it's budget, but also I think it was the right artistic choice. The thing I really appreciate is it's almost the difference between watching a movie and reading a book. I like to just listen to Sadie's story in the background, and I don't like having a lot of visuals because it allows me to illustrate the story of what's going on in my mind, and thus, by proxy, makes me feel more personally attached to what's going on. And so all of these elements happening in Symphony, you have a very lonely feeling world. It's completely devoid of any life outside of Covenant, and you feel this sense of hopelessness and dread come over you every time you enter a new area. And you have this selective music at certain points that evokes this sense of feeling that you really can't get anywhere else. And you have further development of the mystery and narrative and what's happening in this city of New Mombasa through Sadie's story and through the flashbacks of the ODST troops. You have this very gripping and powerful experience, and even though it's not the longest game ever, you're going to be thoroughly engaged for the couple of hours that you are playing it. ODST has a way of making you instantly attached to this world, even though they don't have to say anything. Rookie, aka you, doesn't even say a damn word the whole time, yet you still really care about what happens to him as well as everybody else in this squad. ODST is the epitome of show, don't tell level of storytelling. You can accomplish that using so many different approaches through gameplay, atmosphere, characters, level design, music, and so on. And it's the slow-paced, isolated, melancholy, very lonely feeling of New Mombasa, and then that combined with the more fast-paced, high-action set pieces that you would expect from a more traditional mainline Halo title, I think makes for a really good blend that keeps the pace of the game very interesting and doesn't get too repetitive or monotonous, and I think the pacing is actually almost perfect in ODST. Unfortunately, however, as much as I love the world of ODST, the characters, the environment, and atmosphere, it's not all flawless. There are a couple of big things that I consider to be negatives or drawbacks, and a few of them are actually creative decisions they made, and a few of them I think I can chalk up to them having a lower budget and maybe not being able to spend quite as much time on this project that they would on a mainline Halo title. But for example, one of my personal issues that I have with Halo 3 ODST is, well, the fact that maybe in about half the missions, I don't really feel like an ODST at all. It's kind of a mixed bag across the board, but there are some levels where I feel like it works and some where I just simply don't. And I think the problem is they had ODSTs feel virtually indistinguishable from Spartans, just from a gameplay perspective. The only real differences to speak of is now that you need to pick up health packs to fully restore your HP. You know, you're not quite Master Chief. Also, you have no proximity radar, and more importantly, you cannot dual wield anything in this game. That was a mechanic introduced in Halo 2, and obviously for this game, they could have very well done that, but they made the choice deliberately not to dual wield, and it makes sense. But besides those, you know, small mechanics, there's really no difference between an ODST and just running around as Master Chief. Like, I think the, I don't know, power dynamic is maybe a little bit off. You feel a bit too strong for what you should in this context. There are moments, again, when it works, and I think that there are certain levels, like when you're holding out against all of the Banshees on the rooftop, that feels okay to me because it feels like you're all working together and you should feel a bit more powerful. But even times in the open world with the Rookie, I don't know, it just kind of feels like you can still deal with these squads of Covenant a bit too easily. Sometimes I kind of forget that my character is supposed to be just a rookie, and I genuinely feel like I'm playing as Master Chief in moments. You know, you slip into that mindset. And I've seen people suggest the way to fix this would be to make it so that ODSTs couldn't use Covenant weapons. You'd have to be a lot more careful about the actual, you know, human weapons that you pick up, but also I feel that would really reduce Halo's fun sandbox, and I think the benefit you would get from making you feel a bit more ODST-like would not outweigh the detriment of not being able to use all the fun guns in the game. Just my opinion, but it's a hard problem to solve. Now, this might sound a bit contradictory because on one hand, again, I praised the open world design for not being afraid to have these really lonely, quiet moments where it's just you reflecting on your own thoughts and absorbing the city. That kind of introspective reflection is the most powerful thing about this. Watching the last hope and bastion of humanity crumble before your very eyes and you're completely powerless to stop it, it's an incredibly impactful message and feeling that the game evokes. However, by the same token, as much as the open world is able to strike those feelings in you, I also can't help but think that this open world is very hollow and empty and honestly not very interesting outside of the great atmosphere that it provides. Now, of course, this is coming from a modern day gamer's perspective, and also this was Bungie's first real attempt at something like this, but you know, going back to the game now, you can see clear as day that if they had remade the game in current time, this open world section would be much different. Besides the Sadie story, the superintendent AI, and the occasional Covenant, I mean, there's not really much else to find in this open world. I thought it would have been a fun idea if you, while you were traversing the city, if you were taking out a lot of Covenant in a specific area, by the time you double back to that same spot, it would be cool if they had a beefed up volume of Covenant. They send more reinforcements that way, and so the area gets harder. So you can choose to engage with them or not, but if you do, of course, it's going to get harder from there on out. I don't know, I just feel like that's something that could have made the world feel a bit more responsive and maybe alive, even though, again, that's not really the point. Part of its empty and completely static nature is what invokes those feelings of loneliness, and I get that's kind of the point, but I feel like there's maybe a healthy middle ground somewhere in there. Now, another minor complaint I have actually has to do with the fact that I think the visor ruins the immersion in some areas, particularly in the nighttime open world section, obviously, and this I understand is important because you sort of need that to interact with a lot of the level design, but the main issue I have with it is it takes me out of the experience from time to time. It's like there's moments when you're traversing the streets and you see a squad of Covenant lurking in the shadows, and you don't know exactly how many are there. You can see some heads walking around, but nothing's clear, and if you throw on your visor, it outlines them in red, and you can see precisely how many there are. Now, again, I understand that's probably like a good thing from like a gameplay design perspective, but also I think it's kind of more intimidating, and you feel more like an ODST if you don't really know quite exactly what the threat is. It feels more unknown and menacing that way, and not being able to fully count or even see where your enemies are exactly feels a lot more scary, and the tension is way higher. If you know where all the beacons are to collect to start missions, it's kind of a different experience playing ODST not using your visor at all. There are times where the levels feel like they're unplayable, so it's clear that you're supposed to in some hallways and stuff, but it was a very different experience not being able to quite count how many enemies I'm going to be fighting. So let's come back to the story for a moment. After your initial crash and everybody's been split up, eventually you see the fate of everybody in the ODST squad and eventually how they're able to reconvene and get back together again. And the only one who's still missing is Veronica, but Buck hears her and knows where she is, so they go back instead of escaping New Mombasa to go and try and rescue her.
What? Why? I lost something. Now I know where to find her.
Another mystery is added very early on in the game where you see an alien around her pod that doesn't seem to be Covenant, and later on you even see Covenant strapping explosives to it, so you can tell that there's something else beneath the surface that's going on. Something I love about this game is that as you're traversing the open world, if you're paying attention to the Superintendent AI, he'll let you in on some incredibly fascinating things if you're paying attention, and you'll also learn how this relates to Sadie's story. And speaking of which, if you collect all of the audio logs throughout the game, when you get near the end, when the rookie's going to rescue Veronica, the cop that's coming down to escort you, instead of just dying, he will actually try to confront you. You'll have to showdown with the corrupt cop, and if you don't do this, he'll just end up dying as you come down to this lower level. But the point is, as the rookie, if you took the time to listen to every audio log, it'll show that he learned a lot more about the situation, the cop's corruption, and what was going on. And as you go to approach Veronica and rescue the engineer that the Covenant are going after, you won't pull a gun this time instead, because you actually know what the true nature of the engineers are, and they're not exactly malevolent. It's through this plot twist that it's revealed that all of the effort that everyone in the ODST group was putting in was ultimately to rescue this engineer that has crucial information that the Covenant is looking for. And what you realize is that you essentially went through hell just to extract this small piece of data. You're not Master Chief literally saving planets almost single-handedly, and even though there are moments when the ODST shine and they can do some great things on their own, ultimately you realize that you're just a much smaller piece in this larger story. I really enjoy the rookie going back and Buck going to save Veronica in the end, and then all three of them escaping to get back on the Covenant cruiser and get out of New Mombasa. And, you know, honestly, I think they handle Veronica and Buck's relationship very well. There's clearly still this attraction and love they have for each other, and I think there are moments in which that really shines through. And if saving the woman from a terrible situation is considered now an outdated trope in storytelling, or God forbid considered sexist now, my only point being, I think the way it's conveyed is very tasteful in ODST, and I would even make that same argument for every other ODST member's characterization. I think the ending's very powerful because you could say in the end, no one really got what they set out to do. They failed, essentially, besides getting the engineer. You could say the most important thing was Buck and Veronica getting what they were looking for and being brought back together in some sense. She even hints that there's a chance that things could work out between them and ask her after the war is over. It's just this window into humanity that I felt like the other mainline Halo games really didn't focus on much, and maybe was an aspect that was missing from the Halo universe that ODST does a great job to fill in the gaps. I would also argue that Halo Reach does a fantastic job in this department as well, but ODST I think was the first to really capture it. ODST is one of those few games that, despite the visuals being heavily outdated by this point, is still able to evoke these feelings that you'll be pretty hard-pressed to find in any modern video game. It's not content exactly. This game is like a 2 to 3 hour little art piece. It's worth mentioning that even though ODST didn't have its own dedicated multiplayer, it had this other game mode that would be introduced and carried over to future Halo titles called Firefight, and ODST still has my favorite iteration of Firefight to this day, and that includes Halo Infinite. I think this was developed for a few reasons. Number one, it seems that, you know, wave-based shooters and survival games were very popular around this era anyways, and I think it very clearly drew inspiration from stuff like Call of Duty Zombies, obviously, but also I just think that it makes sense thematically for what ODST is. It's clearly a very hopeless feeling game. And the whole idea is that you really can't beat this mode. It's just infinite wave survival. You play until you die and get overwhelmed, essentially, and that's kind of what's happening in the grand scale of ODST in New Mombasa anyways. So it's a game mode that not only is just fun in its own right, but very much fits thematically into what ODST is trying to offer in this neat little package. I think it's wonderful.
Win this war? Then ask me that again.
At the end of the day, though, what I found most refreshing about Halo 3 ODST was not its combat or levels, even though those can be very exciting and well-crafted in their own right, but it's ultimately the way that this game makes you feel while playing. As opposed to many modern games that we play that weren't forced to get like really creative due to its budget or time constraints to make something really beautiful, ODST was. And they say that necessity breeds creativity, and I think that's exactly what happened here. And I feel like ODST is lightning in a bottle. model. This is not something that could be very easily recreated, even with a remaster, or if they were to go back and try to recapture the spirit of what made this game so legendary. It's something that is truly one of a kind and is very unique even amongst the Halo lineup. One of my favorite single-player experiences of all time, and it's an incredibly refreshing play.